Peterloo opens with an image of confusion on the battlefield of Waterloo. As a young man comes home from war to Manchester, traumatised, Wellington is rewarded, and men in offices in London plan the suppression of labour movements like they would attacks on enemy nations in war. In Peterloo, Leigh is retelling the story of an all-too-forgotten moment in British history, the essential beginning of full-on labour movements in the UK, and the fight for universal suffrage for all people to be able to vote. The cast of the film is a veritable who's who of British actors, featuring not least Maxine Peake as the matriarch of a working-class family in Manchester. Her son returns home from the Battle of Waterloo, obviously traumatised, experiencing something which I think we'd call PTSD nowadays. And additionally, her and her family face the injustices of poor wages, the pressures of poverty, and the problem of having no real representation at all in Parliament. In these scenes, Leigh's immense skill in working with actors is readily apparent. The rhythm of the dialogue, the accents and mannerisms are all well affected and observed. Leigh also does a really good job here of setting up the pressures that were facing working class people at the time. There's an excellent sequence where several people are brought before judges for a variety of different reasons, mostly very petty crimes, a small theft from someone's home for instance, and they're either sentenced to death or sent to Australia, which was essentially a living death sentence at the time. These scenes really address the stakes of committing crimes and how small these crimes could be for the kind of punishments that they'd have, and therefore the pressing need for reform. Because of course, remember, it's not like these people could vote for someone else to represent them in order to change the law. They had basically no representation at all. After this point, the majority of the film's not inconsiderable runtime is devoted to scenes that show rallies and speeches by political leaders in the Manchester labour movement. They're people who are advocating for universal suffrage, for the right to vote, mostly as a way of making sure that they get fairer wages and they're not as impacted by stuff like the Corn Laws, for instance. These scenes are also really well observed. They clearly come from an understanding, a deep understanding of how political movements form and change over time, what kind of pressures there are within those movements. You have people discussing the need to arm themselves and other people saying we ought not to arm ourselves at all. In particular, I was struck by a sequence set in a women's union, a role that's often not articulated when we're talking about older political movements like this, but of course women were involved, they were affected as well. The meeting is chaired by two middle-class women, and a working-class woman in the audience first causes a bit of a scuffle when she gets in because she doesn't want to pay to get in, she can't afford it, and quite rightly the middle-class women are saying, look, no one has to pay because we know what wage is like as a problem. But they continue to use this really elite kind of language to talk about their politics, and this woman repeatedly interrupts the meeting to say, please talk more plainly so I can understand what's happening. I don't have any real education. And that's a really interesting, well-observed scene that feels very relevant today. A lot of the film's runtime, as I said, is devoted to listening to political speeches, but the speeches are so specific to the issues that these people were facing at that time that they don't really feel that relevant to contemporary life. After all, most of the things that the people at the Peterloo Massacre were meeting to discuss or to sponsor were political suggestions and propositions that we already have adopted into our parliament now. Pretty much the only thing they were agitating for that we don't have is a yearly parliament that came up over and over again, which, you know, has its own problems as an issue. There are a couple of reasons why we don't do that, although there are a couple of arguments in favour of it as well. And another issue with devoting so much of the film to very specific political discussions from quite a long time ago is that it means that Peake's character and her family basically drop out of the film for most of the middle of the movie. Now, as far as I can see, Leigh's intent is to use that family as a way for the audience to enter into the Peterloo Massacre as a kind of human event, as a problem for people who were there. Hundreds of people were injured and people were killed at that event by their own government, which obviously is outrageous and something that we should talk about more. It's certainly not something that I ever learned about in school. Although the massacre scene itself is really powerfully portrayed and I think done quite clinically almost to make it very clear about what the facts of what happened were. If the idea was to have Peake's family as a kind of anchor for the film viewer to kind of understand the impact on, then I don't think that works because they're not in most of the film, and so we don't really know them that well by this point. And unfortunately that's because a number of the scenes which they're in after the first maybe half hour to 45 minutes of the film are really clearly politically didactic. There's something a bit old-fashioned about the writing of those sequences. You have this family who have very little formal education, who are talking about the economic impact of the Corn Laws and about systemic power imbalances in the way that Parliament was constituted at the time. And you get these lines that feel quite cheesy, really. You've got Maxine Peake saying, "I've not lost hope, hope's all we've got, but we've got to start small. Even an acorn grows into a mighty oak." And there's something about that that feels not out of place maybe in a communist film of the 1960s, where there was this real want not just to have working class people talking about the issues that really did affect them at the time, but for everything they say to be sort of edifying in some sense. It's a big issue, isn't it? Looking at how politics, both of the viewer and of the filmmaker, integrate with the filmmaking process. It's a problem across arts, but I feel it's really common in film to have that kind of problem. Semi-regularly, I get commenters saying, you really shouldn't be talking about your politics in reviews. And I really reject that. I think it's a good thing for me to be open and honest about the assumptions that I have going into a movie. I'm quite left-wing, a lot of my viewers will know that, but really what I ask for from a film isn't necessarily that it be super left-wing, but rather just that it doesn't portray really damaging political ideas as being positive ones. Now obviously I might disagree with viewers about what those political issues are, but I do try to be open about what my opinions on them are, so at least you know where I'm coming from, even if you don't agree with me. So I had a commenter the other day say, why is it you always say you don't like political films, but when they're left-wing, you're fine with it? I really agree with the politics at the base of Peterloo. But part of my issue with the film is that they're presented in such a didactic way, in a way that has really no room for debate, that says these are actually the issues that occurred and everyone on this side of it was wrong and everyone on this side of it was right. That I really don't feel like I'm watching a film made for a viewer at times. It feels like I'm attending a lecture about the problem. Don't get me wrong, corn laws, bad idea, universal suffrage, good idea. Massacring people who you're supposed to be representing, appalling, and a terrible thing that we should learn about in schools more. But every moment where there could be a more universal theme underneath the specific political discussion the characters are having that could be more relevant to contemporary politics, Leigh pulls away from that. And every moment where the film could pull away from this macro view to look at something more human and personal, and to be honest, motivating or emotional, he pulls away from that too. And that's a real problem for the film as a piece of art, if not a problem for it as a polemic. My issue with it as a political piece is that it also isn't really successful at that, because I think it's too black and white at how it looks at the motivations of the people involved. The sequence I talked about with the different judges is a good example. It's a really good idea on paper, but the performances of the judges, and it's throughout the film, are basically pantomime. There's this leering, sneering snobbishness that's in every single line. I understand that class divides were very real and very problematic at that time, even more so than they are now, where of course they are still a massive issue. And yet somehow it feels like a failure of the director and the actors to produce human characters here. They don't feel like characters, they feel like villains being created for the purposes of convincing the viewer about a political point of view. And that's the problem with all the scenes where the characters sit down and talk about a political issue in depth, because the scenes don't feel like they're for the characters to have that discussion. They feel like they're for the audience to understand what's going on. At the end, I had to ask myself that slightly sticky and quite commercial question about filmmaking, which is, what's the film for? That doesn't have to be just a commercial question, that's an artistic question too. Who do you think's going to see the film? What's going to happen to them as a result of watching it? If the film's a human drama, then it fails by being too absorbed in the minutiae of the political movement that it portrays, at the expense of people, character and emotion that's happening on screen. If the film's supposed to be a polemic or a political piece of propaganda, then it fails because it's preaching to the converted and it's far too distant to be contemporary in the way that it approaches the, in theory, quite universal issues that it portrays. In the end, I think the film's point is simply to fill in the historical record, which out of all of its possible aims, I think it does the best job of. But even then, it doesn't really portray the aftermath of the event, where the actual reforms took place. I went into Peterloo really wanting to like it, not least because I like Mike Leigh, but also because the film essentially lines up with my politics. But I left really disappointed. There's some good stuff in the film, there's amazing performances throughout, and the scope and the grandeur of the directing really allows you to understand how important this event is in British history, and why it's so bizarre that we really don't talk about it in any way. Like, it's not something I ever studied in school, just to be clear. But I couldn't help but shake the feeling the whole time through watching it that the final reason why most people will see this film is because they watch it in a history classroom. And I don't know, maybe that's more impactful than it just being seen by adults in cinemas. But it feels like a bit of a waste of such a major event that we really should talk about more. If you want to talk about Peterloo, or more broadly the representation of politics in film, hit me up down below in the comments. I'd love to talk to you about it. That's it from me. Have a good one. Bye for now.